Louise, should we make a start?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was waiting for some. Okay, welcome everyone this afternoon. I'm going to hand straight to our keynote, Catherine Wenger. You're on mute, Kat.
Classic mistake. Afternoon, everyone. So my name is Catherine Wenger, and I have the great privilege of looking after Arup's water business for the UK, India, Middle East, and Africa. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce this cohort of brilliant speakers. They all have very different but complementary case studies and examples around catchment health and how this is changing and why it's really important, and some really novel things to tell you about. That the world is changing is a phrase we've heard so many times recently that it's actually become passé and it's easy to ignore, and yet it's so true. We've had the parallel challenges of COVID and the climate emergency, and those happening together has highlighted this even more. And then we've had lockdowns, which have bolstered the public's interest and regard for green spaces, wild swimming, and the protection of nature. And alongside that, consider about how we prepare and track and respond to emergencies. And lastly, we've had this urgency to do new things, and that's resulted in wonderful new partnerships and novel approaches being accelerated in a way that we would not have thought possible 3 years ago. So our three talks are linked by the theme of catchments. The first discusses water quality and how essential a catchment approach is to understanding and improving this. The second considers new ways to think about catchments. It includes new partnerships and new ways of working. And the last focuses on how tracking catchment level epidemiology with novel digital tools can help with new ways of tackling illness and even pandemics. So that's the introduction. I hope you are all able to see and hear us fine. Do let us know if there's any challenges. And I'll now hand over to Steve, who will be our host for the session.
Thanks, Catherine. And yes, welcome again to everyone. As Catherine said, we've got 3 sections today, as you can see on the screen there, part 1, 2, and 3, and we've got a range of speakers with different backgrounds and expertise. So hopefully it should be a really enjoyable hour. Roughly, the section is split into 3 in terms of time, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you have any questions as we go through, just ping them in the chat and we can tie them all together and pick them up at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Oliver and Christian.
Thanks very much, Steve. Christian, if you're there, put camera on as well. I'll make a start. So yeah, my name is Ollie and I'm an engineer based at Arup, focusing on water quality. And with me today, I've also got Christian, who is the staff program manager at Cymru Welsh Water. And we're going to be talking to you today about the total catchment approach. So go for the next slide, Steve. So we're going to be talking about total catchment approach and what this is. But to do that, I thought it'd be useful to give a bit of background. And this is going to go all the way back to sewers. So what we focus on here is sewers and their impact and how we reduce that from a catchment approach. So first of all, why do we have sewers? Very, very briefly, it's to convey wastewater, to take all that stuff that we put down our toilets, put down the showers, take it away, treat it, and put treated water out into the rivers and seas. That's the idea. They've been very effective as a public health tool, massively reduce cholera, other diseases, super important. So yeah, they're great. However, if you go to the next slide. In the UK, our sewers are quite old. They are Victorian designs, and they combine surface water, so that's water that comes off roofs and roads, and also our sewage. So they're a mix of rainwater and sewage. So if you look at the first video. So what you can see here is it's a typical rainy day in the South Wales Valley, plenty of rain coming down, and it's going into what we call a surface water network. So that's a network specifically designed just to carry our surface water. And as the camera pans around, you can see water is gushing down. We'll just walk across to there, but it's not flowing that much. And then if you click on the video on the right, this is what I've talked about, our combined sewer. So there's loads of water from both rain and sewage mixing in there. And that's how these are designed. They were designed to combine these two sets of water. But if you go to the next slide. Yeah, the problem with that is they're great, but they can only take so much flow. And so what was designed was these things called CSOs. And this is an example of how they work. If you only have a small amount of sewage going in, it just goes straight to the sewage treatment works and it all gets treated, and that's fine. However, if you've got really wet weather, the pipes only have a certain capacity, and instead of having flooding of roads or people's houses, it was decided that it was better to mix some of the sewage and some of the storm water together and put the excess flow into the rivers or the seas. So it's untreated, but it's diluted. And that's how the systems were designed. You go for the next slide. For a long time, that was seen as generally acceptable, and they were used in times of emergencies and in times of heavy flows. However, there's been two different challenges with climate change and the climate crisis. This weather is getting worse. We've had population growth. We've had a lot of urban creep. So there's more water getting into the sewers from various different ways. At the same time as that, public acceptability of these has reduced. People are using rivers more and more, and people are getting a greater understanding of what's in them. So we've got two different challenges. We've got that these CSOs are being used more, and people's acceptance of them is reducing. If you go to the next slide. So yeah, so what we want to do is do something about these. Traditionally, what we'll do is we'll look at individual CSOs one by one. So this is an example. You do a big study, and this is what Christian leads on, but you'd look at individual CSOs and go, okay, so why is there water coming into this network here? And essentially, what can we do about it? Next slide, please. And this is an example of what you do. So we'd look at the whole system, but again, just for one CSO. And there might be different things we could do. We could take flow out. We could treat the stuff at the end. So we just hit the next slide. And to give you an example of what some of these things could look like, in Welsh Water, we do something called rainscape, which is essentially SUDS. It's different ways of removing water from the network. So on the left, you've got taking flow from the roofs. You could go to planters, you could go into water butts. And you've also got in the middle there swales that store all the surface water that's come onto roads, just to make sure there's a bit less flow in the network, and when it comes in more slowly. And all of that means you get less flow in your CSO and it spills less. The other approach you can see on the right there is that we say, actually, there's not necessarily space to put these rainscape solutions in, but we might be able to treat what comes out with a wetland. So as I mentioned before, what comes out is diluted, and then we just use a wetland or something similar to treat the spills. So this is what we do on an individual CSO level, and it's important work, and we understand it, but it only really affects that one CSO. And Christian is now going to talk about how we can look at this, not just at a single CSO level, but at a whole catchment approach.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Steve, we go to the next slide. So as you can see here, this is one of our catchments. Now, large portions of the sewage network, certainly within South Wales, forms a trunk sewers that flow down, collecting all of the villages to sort of agglomerations, leading us to these large terminal pumping stations and treatment works that are typically based around the coasts. Now, these assets receive a disproportionately large amount of flow from this sort of wider agglomeration compared to their individual immediate catchment area. So therefore, the impact of these agglomerations means that any work that you do for the immediate catchment, or even entirely separation of that immediate catchment, won't necessarily materially impact the performance of that overall assets flow, because it's so reliant upon this wider agglomeration. So in terms of what this actually looks like, if we go to the next slide, you can see here, now this is a catchment plan. This is on the previous slide, you saw a number of these areas that are highlighted. The area highlighted in green is at the A and B catchment. So you can see here we have 31 individual catchments, all leading to a final single terminal pumping station which pumps these flows to treatment. So as you can imagine with these all have different makeups, different areas of impermeable area and permeable runoff that enters our network, as well as obviously the foul flows. You have different ages of the houses here, so some of the newer housing developments there will have separated flows in terms of that surface water, and that rainfall will be separate, but then you have significant areas where you have, as Ollie showed us in that first one, there's rows of terrace houses where the roofs and the gardens are connected. So that's what that's what gives us this makeup of flows, and ultimately all of these join together in these respective areas to bring us down to this terminal station. Now, with this particular example, flow survey here showed that ultimately the top of the catchment receives significantly more, I think nearly 3 times more amount of rainfall than the bottom of the catchment. So again, in terms of solutions here, a hectare of rainscape down in these lower sections where you can see the ones highlighted in pink would be less effective than a hectare of rainscape of the ones if we were to do that up in the top right hand corner, because you're getting the SAR value, so the annual average rainfall value there is significantly higher than the one at the lower end of the catchment. So then if we move on to the next slide, we can see. So how do we start to look at these solutions? So again, you can see this other catchment model shown at the bottom here. Now, one of the particular things we need to focus on is the water quality modelling element of this. You know, there's a public perception piece around CSOs. We all know that almost every day when you pick up on the BBC News website, you'll see there's a story about sewage on there. We know that this is something that is the next big thing for our industry to clean up. But ultimately as well, how do we solution on option benefits tool that we have? We look at the carbon cost of this. We have our unit cost database as to how much all of these options cost. And we'll ultimately have a network model created for each of these assets to understand the personality of them, how they react to rainfall in different ways, because different areas of impermeable and permeable runoff will give you a different personality for each CSO. There's no one of these into this wider network model to get that understanding of how they all interact with each other and what impact doing one solution in one area will have on the solutions in the other area. And this way we move on to one of the key Steve, can we move on to the next slide? Perfect. You can see, so here you can see another one of these schematics of this network model. And if we just play the video here, you can see we've got a baseline cost and a total cost. And as we press the video, you can see what this option is doing is it's running through all of the different solutions. You can see all the different costings there, anywhere from that then looks at all of the options are, and the key element of this is, as we talked about earlier, that rainfall at the top end of the catchment is far more significant than the rainfall at the bottom end of the catchment. So actually, where you're running through is potentially going to reduce your overall costing and your overall solution, the amount of carbon and everything that's involved in the input to this solution, because you're picking the low-hanging fruit and the ones that offer you the most return on the investment, the highest sort of value for what you're inputting, and then how that then impacts on further down the network in terms of actually, that's where doing that additional hectare at the top of the network will reduce that flow coming down, which allows you to pass more flow forwards lower down the network to get your same outcome of impact to the environment. So this is where all of these assets need to be taken together to get that wider understanding piece around how we create these solutions. But then if we move on to the next slide, the key thing is, why do we need to create these solutions? And as you can see here, so this is the water quality model for the whole of the catchment, which Ollie's now going to talk about.
Yeah, so in addition to what Christian said, we've tried to get the lowest cost solution that removes the highest number of spills. And it's important to think again about why did we do this? Public perception is a big thing, but fundamentally, we want to be improving our rivers. We want to improve river health. So the way we did this was much in the same way. We split up our network and looked at the different CSOs and how you could do different things. We split up the river they drain into. And generally, you'll find that your sewer network more or less mirrors your river network. It's all flowing downhill, gravity fed. And that's what we did here. We split it up into a few different sections and combined the CSOs that drain into each of those sections. The red ones are really high spillers, the green ones are fairly low spillers, and the yellow is somewhere in the middle. So then what we did was we took a couple of the best solutions that we'd found from this cost modeling. We found the ones that reduce the number of spills at a reasonable cost, and we fed it through this water quality model. It doesn't look at everything, but it looks at BOD, your biological oxygen demand, and ammonia. Studies have shown that these are sort of the key ones that CSOs affect, especially because they only spill for a small amount in a year, but they might push up your really high levels, and that's what you want to avoid. So we did the modeling with what's it currently doing, and then reran it with the outputs from that model. The key point of that is to understand what's currently going on, how can we improve it, and does this lowest cost solution correspond to water quality? Because ultimately that is the goal of what we're doing. So that's kind of our one River Avon approach. And Christian, do you want to talk a bit about how this is going to translate to looking at all of our SOAF program, all of Wales? Christian,
so Steve, we just pop into the next slide. As you can see, this is a map of all of our CSOs mapped within the England and Wales. We do have a small portion of England as well, but that sort of middle section of Wales isn't covered by that. Sitting on 2,333 individual CSOs. So we have monitors on every single one of our, or 98.9%, I believe, currently, of all of our CSOs throughout our network. So that gives us a really good understanding of how frequently we are making these discharges to the environment. Now, within this current 5-year funding cycle, we're looking at over 750 of these highest spilling assets to determine the impact they're having and look at what options that we have to reduce those. Now, our targeted investment is aimed at reducing impact on all high priority sites by 2035. But as we talked about at the beginning of this, immediate catchments in one element doesn't mean you're going to resolve that issue for all of them. And resolving one asset doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to enable that river to, you're not going to prevent a reason for not achieving good against WFD status by just removing that one CSO. And again, all of these CSOs are interlinked. They all have that interrelationship. The ability to reduce, the ability to do a large amount of rainscape or SUDs in one area may have a significant impact on other areas where you may not be able to deliver that, and that may allow you to pass more flows forwards. So I think the days of picking up an individual CSO and looking how we can resolve that, we're past that now. Getting that overall understanding of how we can improve the ecology of the whole watercourse by implementing solutions that are the best solution in terms of physically and what we're actually delivering for the environment, but also in terms of customer bills, running our modelling, running that to understand how we can get to the solution which deals with the most effective way of getting to that environmental impact is going to be key, especially with the cost of living crisis that we're facing currently.
Thanks, Christian. So
Ollie, is there anything else you want to add?
I'm just going to finish off there by saying, as I said, we've looked at how can we look at CSOs from a catchment approach and how can we improve river health. But CSOs are only a small part of the picture. They're what we do on a day-to-day, but we actually want to look at rivers overall. So I'm hoping now to hand over to Amina from the Rivers Trust, who's going to be looking at catchment-based approaches for entire river systems.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Amin Abubakar. I'm the Director of Strategy and Stewardship at the Rivers Trust. And I'd like to talk to you today about how we're using catchment-based approach to start to drive that transformational change across our water catchments. Next slide, please. Just a little bit on the Rivers Trust. We're an independent community-led charity. We're an umbrella body for the Rivers Trust movement, which brings together over 60 member trusts across the UK and Ireland. We're 27 years young and continue to grow. We were actually one of the fastest growing movements in the UK at the moment. And we work with local communities, but also with national organisations to stop pollution, build climate resilience, and help nature recovery in rivers. And our vision, please next slide, is about wild, healthy, natural rivers valued by all. And our mission to protect, promote, and enhance our freshwater ecosystems for people and wildlife. But we're up against some pretty tough challenges in our water environment, with only about 16% of our rivers in the UK having achieved some good ecological status. But we're seeing that decline in freshwater biodiversity worldwide, really, since the 1970s. And our water resources are not resilient enough to cope with some of the climate change and biodiversity crises we're now facing. And there's a bit of a disconnect with communities, and that's one of the things we're experiencing in the face of all these global crises, because there's a bit of analysis paralysis and what can I do for my corner of the world, really, and how can I help to recover the natural environment. So we work with people, and people are quite key to how we're going to do that. Next slide, please. And convening and brokering relationship is one of our key strengths. And we're creating long-term collaboration, joining forces with others to solve the most pressing issues in our water environment around too much water, too little water, and too dirty water in the wrong places. We want to advocate for change. We want to accelerate that change, and really looking at influencing system transformation, really breaking away some of the silos we're seeing in terms of how solutions are being delivered on the ground. And we want to really catalyze delivery at scale and investment at scale. And we're doing that by focusing on these 5 pillars that represent our key strengths, the convening, which I mentioned before, but also communicating to a broader society and community, and really being evidence-led about the data we're starting to share. We do a lot of work around advocacy, but also being cutting edge around innovation and some of the solutions we're delivering on the ground, and working with others to start to see large-scale implementation of nature-based solutions, which is quite at the core of what we do. So I'll let some of our stats actually do the talking for us. Next slide, please. We're really busy. This slide just kind of demonstrates the breadth of the projects we're working on, from investment readiness opportunities, creating markets for nature, working with others to leverage large-scale investment from blended sources, but also from private sector, to working with the agricultural sector on nature-friendly farming, to planting trees and campaigning for change around rivers and making them much more healthy and more usable for recreational purposes, to working with the private sector around water stewardship to really help them to understand their water-related risks and how they can implement catchment-based strategies that minimize those risks, particularly around water efficiency and long-term sustainability. We really focus on collective action and mitigating risks at catchment scale and building resilience across our water environment. Next slide, please. And you know, we like I said, we're very, very busy. And just to give you an idea of some of the figures, in 2020, despite the thing that happened in 2020, we continued to work through lockdown with thousands of volunteers. We planted thousands of trees. We cleaned litter out of our rivers. We worked with farmers to stop agricultural pollution. Around the country, we showed that by working with others, we can rebuild this whole trinity of our water catchments around thriving habitats, natural flows, healthy water quality, even during a time of crisis as it was in 2020. And I think it's fair to say that the pandemic failed to slow the flow of the Rivers Trust movement, really. But next slide, please. We're not just about the work that we do on the ground. We are starting to tackle some of those big, wicked problems. So, such as, for example, the fact that we have a huge gap in previous slide. A huge gap in environmental data monitoring and limited availability of robust evidence that can tell us and give us a much bigger insight in terms of how our catchments are performing at national scale. But on the other hand, there's an overwhelming choice around data sets that are not always standardized, accessible, or easy to understand, really. So we're looking to fill in some of those gaps around data and evidence and be much more collaborative. Next slide, please. So in order to avoid this fragmentation around data collaboration and siloed decisions, we've pulled together a project, a £7 million project, that's looking to create the first national framework for standardized citizen science approaches, really getting that community-led monitoring and high-density data that's much needed, really, to help decision-making. So this will integrate cheap and cheerful but standardized citizen science approaches with local monitoring and other low-cost sensors, but also to create that high-density data that can then be tapped into national decision support tools. And we're working with others in this project under a strategy for shared open data, to make communities into citizen scientists, engaging them in the issues and solutions to manage our water environment better and actually leads to more informed decisions. So over the next 3 years, the CASCO project, or Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative, is going to tap into over 15,000 hours of volunteering monitoring time per year, covering over 1,000 square kilometre area of catchment area in 9 demonstrated areas across the UK, bringing together more than 30 partners to deliver this project, including water companies, other environmental NGOs, academia, regulators, and communities. So we're also about, next slide, please, creating strategic partnerships that will help us to mainstream nature-based solutions. I think nature-based solutions have got such a key role to play in making our catchments more resilient to the crisis we're facing. So we're working with others to create those strategic partnerships to really start to remove key barriers to nature-based solutions, particularly around adoption, standardization, data and evidence, like the work we're doing with the CASCO project, to really kind of understand how we can have a better understanding of how they perform, how these solutions perform, and what are the benefits they're delivering for nature. And finally, how do we catalyze large-scale investments for nature-based solutions? Next slide, please. A good example of this strategic work around mainstreaming nature-based solutions is our Natural Course project, which is a 10-year project, Life IP funded, 20 million euros, to look at how do we overcome some of the biggest barriers preventing achievement of good ecological status, and how do we catalyze more of the catchment-based approach to deliver those benefits in the northwest of England. So this has been going on for 7 years now. We've got another 3 years to finish, and it's already delivering huge benefits in the northwest. And we're looking to obviously cross-pollinate and disseminate this across the country as well. Next slide, please. And we also do a lot of work around creating markets for nature so that we can start to leverage investment at scale. At the moment, a lot of the investment and funding that goes to deliver nature-based solutions and catchment-based approach is quite siloed. We've got water companies really pushing more investment towards outputs and permit requirements and upgrade of their assets. But they also do a lot of work at catchment scale, but isn't necessarily aligned with local authorities, developers, supply chain, retailers, etc. So we're really looking to pull a lot of this together and create markets for nature, create trades around ecosystem services and the benefits the nature-based solutions provide, so that we can leverage a lot more funding, including through green finance. So we've just piloted a groundbreaking project in the Wyre catchment, again in the northwest, through our Natural Course project, that looked at creating those markets for natural flood management. It's been really well received, and it's inspired a number of these types of projects across the country already. Next slide, please. We're also about democratizing data, and I talked about the CASCO project and how that's looking to standardize how we monitor catchments and how we collect data, but we're also about informing the public opinion. We really need to see that action coming from local communities. We need to raise awareness about some of the issues we're facing. So we've got, as a national umbrella body, the Rivers Trust brings these big issues facing rivers into the national debate, really. And last year we published our State of Our Rivers report that shows for too long now our rivers have been polluted, over-abstracted and fragmented. And really rivers are at the front line of our current crisis in biodiversity, water and climate. With the Rivers Trust sewage map, we've also put forward our best evidence and data in the hands of the public and made people a lot more aware about some of the risks around CSO spilling and how polluted some of their rivers are, and brought that debate to the public sphere, really. Next slide, please. We are about advocating for change. We want more transparency around the policy and decision making. We want to be part of that decision making. We do represent society, and we know that we're not going to see the best solutions if we don't see more collaboration, more accountability, and much more governance and good governance that is much more inclusive and participatory. So we're really advocating for that as well. Next slide, please. So ultimately, through our experience, and hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of all the things we're involved in terms of driving that transformational change to catchment-based approach, we know that delivering a more resilient water environment requires systems-based approach, one that brings together integrated and prioritised planning that's much more collaborative and participatory. But it's also about leveraging significant funding to cover a lot of the gaps we're seeing in investment to make our water environment more resilient. We want to see much more joined up funding and investment opportunities, but not about profit, but being about value-based and delivering multiple benefits. And ultimately, it's about that large-scale delivery of solutions that will make the water environment more resilient and creating adaptive stewardship for the long term. And again, next slide, please. Finally, this is about people. People are part of the solution. And our member trusts and our communities are working really hard across the country, bringing others around how we can create sustainable and resilient solutions for our water environment and how we can ultimately bring our rivers back to life. Thank you.
Thanks, Amina. Got one last slide there for you. That was brilliant. Thank you. And then moving swiftly onwards to the part 3 of our presentation today, and that's wastewater-based epidemiology. And I'm going to hand you straight over to our team of experts who are going to be talking to you today.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Steve, and thank you, Ollie, Christian, and Amina for the presentations before. So my name's Joe Shuttleworth. So I'm the Global Digital Water Skills Lead at Arup. I'm joined by my colleague, Olivia Bailey, who leads a lot of our work in wastewater-based epidemiology and sort of environmental monitoring for health, and Professor David Graham from the Newcastle University. We're going to talk to you a bit today about novel approaches to managing health within catchments, so and the One Health agenda. So I hope you find it interesting. And yeah, can we get the next slide, please? So firstly, potentially a challenge. So when we talk about novel innovations, you know, how many of these are actually a rediscovery and potentially of either a natural process? You know, in the case of when people are talking about green infrastructure in cities, you know, we need to avoid the narrative that we invented nature. But with our infrastructure, potentially we're rediscovering its original purpose. So in England, sort of wastewater systems are originally a public health intervention. So in the 19th century, John Snow discovered the link between wastewater and cholera. At the same time, the Great Stink of London drove Parliament to get Joseph Bazalgette to build the Great Sewers, which became a blueprint for implementing and sort of managing water and wastewater globally. How this was viewed by the people at that time can be viewed in what the buildings look like that are part of that sewer system. Crosskeys is a pumping station in South London, and if you go inside it, I haven't got a photo now, but you can look up a photo of it. You know, it looks like the inside of a cathedral. The people in the 19th century viewed the sewage and wastewater systems as a sort of gift from God. And it's interesting now to think and reflect potentially on what we think about our sewers and whether we think about them at all. If we go to the next slide, please. So how can this view of water systems be reimagined for the 21st century? So we face different problems. So as Amina touched on earlier, so we're facing a health crisis, which can be seen in COVID directly, but also a sort of more longer term health crisis. we're facing a sort of biodiversity crisis, through the loss of habitat. We're facing an ecological crisis through impact on food and sort of food security, and we're also obviously facing a climate crisis. So One Health is a sort of fairly commonly commonly termed approach to sort of recognizing the connection between human health and environmental health, the health of the built environment and sort of ecosystem health. And how can viewing things through this One Health lens help us sort of understand and sort of reimagine the role of our water systems in understanding health at a catchment level. So if we go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Joe. So wastewater-based epidemiology is a bit of a mouthful. We can also say WBE. This is a process of monitoring wastewater biomarkers to give an indication of human health or environmental health. So by inspecting these biomarkers in sewage for large populations, we can gather anonymized, honest data on the reflection of health of the society. So this includes factors such as disease prominence or lifestyle choices, drug use, or mental health. So this data set that you get from looking at these biomarkers can give a really holistic snapshot of what's happening in society. And it's not dependent on surveys or people developing symptoms of a certain condition, or how proactive you are in getting to see your doctor. You just need to be connected to a wastewater collection system. So it's a really holistic view of what's happening in society. If we can go to the next slide, Steve. So at Arup, we specialize in multiple aspects of the built environment. So what we're really interested in is how WBE data can be used to develop health-led design and decision-making. For instance, how WBE data can be used alongside clinical data to guide healthcare responses, advise policy development, monitor impacts of change over time, and inform design of healthier environments. So we recently published a report that I've linked there in the top corner that explores some of these future scenarios for WBE. And this just aims to kind of unpack some of the questions that surround its use at different scales. So we've explored certain scenarios within this report at kind of catchment level and higher and lower levels. A dynamic hospital planning. So ensuring capacity is available and staffing levels are available to meet up and coming health demands, or we could use this data to inform how doctors prescribe different drugs when they become ineffective. Or what if neighborhood level data could be available to allow comparisons of health across the city and augmented with other data to provide evidence that supports urban health related policy and initiatives like localized vaccine pop-ups in places where you see a rising hotspot of a certain disease, or promote cycling infrastructure in an area where obesity is a problem, or perhaps health-related educational programs in certain areas of cities. So the next slide, please. I'm now going to pass on to our real expert today, Professor David Graham from University of Newcastle. And he's a professor of ecosystems engineering, and he's going to talk to us today about global health protection and antimicrobial resistance.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm basically going to provide you 3 cases at different scales that show you where and how wastewater epidemiology has provided very useful information for health protection. Next slide. The pitch is wastewater epidemiology for health protection is something that's critically important. What's particularly important about it, though, is that it's a way of actually making up for weaknesses in public health surveillance. In other words, because you can crowdsource information about community health through wastewater and water, you can then make decisions at a strategic level that don't require the same depth of infrastructure that maybe that doesn't exist in some places. So it's basically can be used at different scales and in different contexts. And as I'll explain, it's almost critical if we proceed with One Health solutions to health, which is the main modus operandi right now at the UN. And I show you a report that I was involved in that came out a few months ago, talking about the importance of the environment in the spread of antimicrobial resistance, which I'll explain in a little more detail in a few moments. Once you've got the wastewater epidemiological data, then you can develop models, and you can overlay those models on climate change models and test out future scenarios. So if it's drying, if it's warming, if it's more erratic in terms of precipitation, these are things that you can model once you've got some in situ data. And I'll give you an example of some information that we've got that's tried to do that to some extent. And in the final thing relative to my talk in my 3 cases is I'm defining a catchment both as something that's engineered or something that's natural. An engineered catchment is a sewer. A natural catchment is a river. And as I said, I'm going to use antimicrobial resistance as my example here. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of explaining up front as to what that means and why sampling is, why wastewater epidemiology is so appropriate for AMR problems. Next. So what can we measure, what, where, and why? Basically, wastewater epidemiology can measure pretty well anything anywhere. But there's really 2 main purposes. We want to measure things like water, sediments, wastewater, soil, air. It could be any sort of matrix that's exposed, that we're exposed to. And what we measure in that matrix is different things that affect our health. They're either human, animal, environmental exposures that might cause us risks. In other words, environmental things that we can detect that will cause risk to people people and animals on a regular basis. The other thing we can use wastewater markers for is looking at the ambient health of the community. And that's basically what made wastewater epidemiology famous, because most everywhere in the world we're using it to try and track SARS fragments in the environment relative to exposures and spread. Now, there's no limitation as to what you can measure. We've measured, in the SARS case, we measured virus fragments, but you can measure chemicals, other microorganisms, genetic markers, genomic markers. The thing you're marking, the thing you're measuring really just depends upon the health question and the matrix that you're trying to address. So before I go into my case examples, I'm going to basically talk about AMR very briefly, and then we'll show you some ways in which we've used wastewater monitoring and water monitoring as an aid to understand health questions. Next. So AMR, it's antimicrobial resistance, just to give you a sense of its scale. Estimated about 1.27 million people, additional deaths are attributed to AMR in 2019. Because of this and related, even more worrying information, the WHO and UN has made it a major health priority, which has resulted in some of these reports that are coming out right now. It's bad. And it seems to be getting worse. And to be very honest, the places where it's seen the worst are in the least and lowest resource settings. So WBE can basically help in the places where need help the most. So resistance is the capacity of microorganisms to defend itself against antibiotics and other antimicrobials. Antimicrobial resistance exists as it existed forever in bacteria. It's existed. It's present in nature because organisms have chemical ways of defending themselves. And we've come to call what those chemicals are as antibiotics or antimicrobials. But what we've done by polluting our environment and using antibiotics therapeutic and non-therapeutically, we've increased the rate of microbial evolution, so that now, rather than having just background organisms, we've got many, many new organisms that are drug resistant that were never drug resistant before. And that's what we say when we're talking about increasing drug resistance, because that resistance is often in pathogenic or disease-causing organisms. Now, resistance primarily happens in the gut of the person who's using, or the animal that's using the antibiotic. But once that material is spread to the environment in fecal matter and other wastes, it then can spread very rapidly across human and animal populations. And the value of wastewater epidemiology is we can measure it. And that's what we do. Next slide. So to give you just a bit of a sense of why AMR is a particularly tricky case, but where wastewater epidemiology is particularly useful, we have to think about what AMR is and what we would need to measure to use wastewater monitoring to help us understand spread. So AMR evolution and selection is a microbial, genetic, and ecological phenomenon. We expose our microorganisms of all different types to antibiotics. It kills 99% of those organisms because that's what the drugs are for, but 1% survive. And the problem is that 1% that survived are stronger, and they become competitive and become dominant. And through what we functionally done by using antibiotics has created an upward spiral towards more and more resistant organisms. Next slide. So the problem we have, and this is where wastewater epidemiology becomes important, is this selection process is happening everywhere. It's happening in medicine, it's happening in veterinary medicine, it's happening in the environment, it's happening associated with crop production and the food supply. It's happening everywhere. And the problem is that all of these parts of the One Health spectrum are all connected by water and air. And so if they're all happening simultaneously, it becomes really difficult to try and identify what the problem is, because all you're dealing with is the pooled response of all these sources. And this is where wastewater epidemiology becomes critical, because it's the way we can start disentangling the sources. And once we can disentangle the sources, we can then start coming up with specific solutions to reduce the transmission and spread. And that's the type of thing that I've spent the last 15 to 20 years trying to do relative to drug resistance. So we can measure resistance genes, we can measure resistomes, antimicrobials, microbiomes, all different measures of chemistry and biology to do with resistance. And that's what we functionally have done. So now I'm going to move into the cases. Next slide, please. Now, my first case is where we're looking at our catchment as being the whole world. And this particular map that I've presented for you is a map of the relative sanitation index in each country in the world based on water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure capacity. And basically, this is how we manage our waste and protect our water. And as you can see, the dark colors are where WASH is limited, such as sub-Saharan Africa. It's darker in Southeast Asia, the subcontinent, and in parts of South America. And so bear this in mind. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Olivia press the button in a second. And I'd like you to watch the changes in the colors, because what we've done is with the project that we did for the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, we projected accounting for climate change and other things other than just sanitation, where the greatest potential risks of waterborne AMR are. So now press the button and watch the colors change. Okay, we've seen some places stay dark, but we've seen a lot of places become darker. And those are the places where other things other than just sanitation are a problem. Inappropriate use of antibiotics or drugs in agriculture, manufacturing waste entering the environment. These are the things that aren't directly related to sanitation. They're also bearing in mind these modeling was done within concert with climate change considerations. Drier, hotter places are going to have one effect. Cooler, wetter places are going to have another effect. And what you can see is some places that were moderately dark have become very dark, like the subcontinent, Pakistan, China and that part of the world. And that's because antibiotics and chemicals are used for other purposes there, as well as just therapeutic responses. So this is the projection. Now press one more time. And this is real data based on wastewater epidemiology. It's pretty hard to see because the screen is pretty small. But what the graph on the top left shows you is if you just look at the size and the position of the bars, the big bar on the left is Africa. The big bar on the right is South America. And that's the number of resistance genes per sample volume in sewage in those locations. So basically, we are already measuring the consequences of sanitation around the world. And this is wastewater epidemiology. So it tells us that these mirrors to do with the One Health spectrum, but particularly sanitation, are directly mirroring the spread of drug resistance. The question is, each of those places in the world has got a problem for a different reason. So what I'm going to do now is start looking at this at a slightly smaller scale and look at what we can learn when we look a little bit more closely at a particular place. Next. So before I do that, I just want to remind you what we can learn from wastewater sampling. First, we can measure microbiomes, all the bacteria that are present, all the microorganisms there, viromes, all the virus, including SARS, protistomes, things like cryptosporidium, health indicators that are of eukaryotic origin, and then we can measure chemicals. And what we want to know from surveillance is we want to know places where we need to act. We want to provide advice and guidance to national and international health protection strategies, and we want to source track local threats. So we want to identify places where solutions can be specifically done. Next. So the example I'm going to use relative to local threats is the Skudai River catchment in Malaysia, where we've been working for about 6 or 7 years. It's at the southern end of peninsular Malaysia, across the straits from Singapore, this river. Next slide. It's a moderate size catchment, and it's got interesting and diverse physical characteristics. So what we did, and we've done this over a number of years, is monitor water quality, volumetric flows, chemicals that are in the water, have grown microorganisms in it, and also looked at the sum of all the resistance and the microbial communities in the samples. Next. So from that, we can then use these different things we've measured chemically and biologically and genetically to tell us things about what's happening along the catchment relative to the catchment health. And I've only flagged 2 in those little circles, one to do with dissolved auxin, DO, and the other is called ESBL coli, which is a generic type of drug-resistant bacteria that's found predominantly from the gut. And what I've circled is the low point in the ESBL coli and the high point in the DO. And the reason why I flagged that is that as you go down this particular catchment from S1 down to S8, between the site S5 and S6, which is on the map on the left, you go by an area where there's predominantly palm plantations and there's no sewage inputs for all intents and purposes into the river. So what happens is as you go down the river, the quality of the water declines. However, at that one site, just between the plantations, the quality of the water goes up and the drug resistance in the water goes down. And that's very promising in the sense that if you actually remove the waste from the systems, which are obviously entering the system at other parts of the system, you can improve water quality. And in fact, we've done this in catchments, in different catchments in other parts of the world. Next slide. We can also look at the chemicals are present. I'm only including this slide. There's lots of information, much more than you want, because of the stuff we did on the seasonal effects of what we could measure with wastewater, with wastewater methods. And what you can see, if you can look very closely, is that the dry season, you've got much higher concentrations of chemicals than in the wet season. Now, higher concentrations means there's potential greater risk of the effects of those chemicals on residents of the river and residents near the river. And it's that changes in climate related to, in this case, precipitation, other cases related to temperature, are the things that we're having to bear in mind relative to these future climates. But we can measure these types of phenomena using wastewater methods now, which we could then build into models of the future. Next. This is just to show you once again that at that station 6 along our river, which is below our palm plantations, the whole suite of different types of resistance declines. If you just look at panel B, there's a drop at 6. What's particularly interesting is that 2 of the 3 most dominant types of resistance we found there were aminoglycoside and beta-lactam. Those are the ones of greatest medical importance in hospitals. So once again, we're using wastewater measurements to learn something of direct and immediate value relative to healthcare. Next. So now we go down to an even smaller scale. So this is a subcatchment of the catchment that I've just shown you. And I'm just looking between the 2 stations at the very top. S1 comes directly out of very rural countryside, primarily just palm trees and it's not even plantations. S2, however, is after you've gone through an area where there's local development and primarily suburban development, without almost no waste treatment. And the only thing I want to show you is that Venn diagram that's in the table. If you look, and this shows the diversity of drug resistance you find at S1 compared to S2. And what we see is because we didn't have adequate waste treatment between 1 and 2, 42 types of new types of resistance appeared in the water because of the waste inputs. That tells us that the main driver of problems to do with resistance in this particular reach, and probably within this whole catchment, is inappropriate or inadequately treated wastewater that's entering the river and causing resistance to be increased and be spread downstream. Next. So, in conclusion, wastewater epidemiology is a way that we can prioritize healthcare solutions. But it's only going to be possible if we start thinking more holistically. We can identify exposures and health conditions at different scales. And in reality, the only limitation is our imagination, because I've shown you just a couple of examples here, but they're only a few examples. The one thing I want to warn people who do the environmental monitoring side is that we've got to tailor the information to what healthcare decision makers need. One of the problems that's happened in the pandemic to do with SARS is that people have monitored SARS and wastewater around the world, but it's not always been measured and reported back to public health officials in a form that could be useful to them. And that's something that we're working very heavily right now on, is trying to come up with a better way of translating what we can learn in the environment to those that are going to actually use that information for health protection. And once we've got that buy-in, we can then collectively model future conditions for health protection. Thank you. So back to you, Olivia.
Thanks, David. Fascinating stuff. I think, well, that is it for our presentations this afternoon. We've got 20 minutes left now, so I'm going to open up the floor to any questions on the call. I don't know if any questions appeared in the chat, Louise, in the past 5 or 10 minutes.
No additional ones.
No, okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. You don't need to see that. Yeah, are there any questions from the room? I've got a couple, but I'd like to invite others to ask them first. Okay, deathly silence. Okay, so my first question was, well, who shall I start with? I think Amina's dropped off. Is that right, Louise?
I was just about to drop off. Yes, Steve. Apologies. Jump on another call.
No,
Thanks.
That's fine. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We'll catch up again soon. Bye-bye. Christian, are you still on the call? And Ollie?
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay, great. I had a question that links to something Amina mentioned around affordability, and storm overflows are very much linked with what was just talked about as well by David and Olivia and Joe. Storm overflows, one of the biggest challenges of our time, and at a time where affordability is, again, probably an equally big challenge. Are there any novel ways or different ways that Welsh Water are potentially thinking about funding the investment needed?
At this point in time, no, I don't think. I think the big challenge that we really have at the moment is obviously for years we've gone through different cycles where there's been different focuses and different drivers on our wastewater network as a whole, focuses on compliance and things like that previously. It's got us to the point now where ultimately over the past 10 years, there's been monitoring installed. So that information we get from the monitoring now, in terms of obviously 90% of the data is based off depth gauges and what that looks like in the sewer, that helps us paint that overall picture. We then start to tie that in with our drainage and wastewater management plans. That gives us a far better understanding of not just now, but where we're looking through to 2050, where there's potential for flooding within our, where there's potential pollution and that deterioration of our network to understand. In terms of then that kind of the additional impacts, there are watercourses that the kick sampling that has been done as part of the SELF programme has shown there has been some potentially sometimes either no impact or low impact from the direct discharge of that CSO itself, but there have been indicators in terms of obviously the changing classes and the taxa of the, such as from agriculture, and that's not pointing the finger at agriculture, that I'm sure there are plenty of cases where that isn't the case, but you get that balancing, and particularly when we're talking about phosphorus and nitrates and that eutrophication of watercourses. So sometimes actually a more feasible or a higher impact solution could be funding some of the work that Amina's talked about in terms of working to get that greener farming, the afforestation, those kinds of elements, to help change the more significant impact on the overall water health of that watercourse than the removal of that CSO, which may not be having, or may only be having a very minor localized impact or no impact at all. Obviously, further research is really needed to get that understanding. But there is a key piece, but I think within that there is that cultural change. Obviously, spill numbers only tell half the picture. We all know that it's the volume that can, and the timing of those discharges that ultimately have the massive impact. But from a cultural perspective, the impact of if we go back a number of years ago, and there was the image of the seahorse with its tail wrapped around the plastic straw that I think struck home for most people. Now we go anywhere, we talk about it, if you go anywhere, you won't find a plastic straw. You'll find paper ones, you'll find potato starch ones, but you don't find that plastic. That drive, I noticed it when I went to buy electricals, bought some new plug fascias, and all the plug fascias now come in cardboard packaging with everything inside there's cardboard, or only packaging is a potato starch, because there's that drive to move away from single-use plastics. I think that the impact of that, if we apply that to our wastewater network in terms of the 3 Ps of what you're allowed to flush and what people do flush, and that sewer abuse and the impact that has in terms of fatbergs, which decrease the amount of flow we can pass through the network, which then ultimately has that backing up effect and causes these CSOs to be used more frequently to prevent the flooding in people's houses. If as a nation, obviously wider than the UK, that if we move away from those flushing things such as wet wipes and sanitary products that aren't designed to be flushed, if we move away from that, if we also move towards having biodegradable, disposable, flushable wet wipes that do disintegrate, do dissolve, and don't cause these fatbergs, the overall volume of flows that we are conveying to these treatment works will only increase, and that will have us need to do the research to really understand the impact of that. But the impact of that in comparison to actually removing, we could have CSOs that may only discharge in really heavy storm events, which is really what they're designed to do. if there weren't these contributing factors that were causing those reductions in flows to get us to the point where they were being used more frequently.
Great, thanks, Christian. Yeah, it's multifaceted, isn't it? And there's definitely some lessons we can learn there from other things that have gone on. I've got a question that's come in from the chat, and I think this is probably aimed at David, Olivia, and Joe. Is the monitoring done by government, public health, or a different research group?
I suppose I could answer that. It depends upon the country and the context. In the UK, it's an academic government industry partnership, depending upon the type of things that are being done. The health information is largely within the hands of the government. The environmental monitoring, it can be either an industry, government, or academic. But I've also worked in other parts of the world where a lot of the most useful health information has actually come from the private sector. So I think the drive for using the methods that we've talked about is something that's driven at a governmental level, and how it's implemented sort of varies from place to place. I mean, one of the things that we're pushing in a lot of the guidance documents that we're writing is countries and places developing national action plans for whatever question it happens to be, whether it's infectious disease or drug resistance or whatever. But it tends to be a combination of all of the options. However, I've never seen in a place where it's worked effectively, where the government was not a real strong driver of what's going on.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. And I had a question kind of linked to that then was, I mean, wastewater is clearly a really, really rich source of information that we're just starting to kind of understand the potential of. And one of your maps showed, you know, all of Africa in the darkest color, which is just, you know, an amazing scale. So what governance would you need in place to try and drive a WB approach? I'm guessing we're nowhere near there yet, but what? Oh,
well, you don't have to use your imagination to say how hard a question that is to answer, because what you don't realize if you live in one country or have traveled to a few countries is how different each country is. We work in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, and looking from the farthest distance, they look like they're the same. You couldn't find three places that are more culturally different. And so to answer your question is it's each place is different. And I think how you approach the problem of monitoring and incentivizing action, that sort of thing really is very specific to each place. And I know I'm not really giving you a very specific answer, but it's each place is different. But the ultimate thing is the places where we've seen the approaches used most effectively or where the government has been most proactive. And there are problems. I mean, I'll give you this. The obvious example is, you know, we make the assumption, say if we're using classical wastewater epidemiology, which is has been done across Europe and North America and the UK, we have sewers. Well, 44% of the world doesn't have sewers. So how do you implement wastewater epidemiological approaches where at best you've got septic tanks, pit privies, that sort of thing? And how do you then start collecting samples? Because one of the nice things about wastewater monitoring is it's anonymous. How do you keep it anonymous if each pit has to be sampled in some way? And we have great debates of those of us that do this at global scales as to how do we protect the rights of the individual in exchange for the value that the knowledge we can gain is so valuable for the wider population. So, I mean, I could talk around in circles for an hour, but the bottom line is there's a lot of questions that are really important. And so one of the things we're trying to do is come up with the most equitable and fair ways of monitoring the information. We're really, really big on trying to empower local places to solve their own problems and assisting them in whatever way we can in terms of guidance as to how to go about doing it, given the nature of their existing infrastructure relative to water and waste and air. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but that sort of talked around the edges of it, at least, I think.
No, that was really interesting. Are there any other questions coming on the chat? I've got another one, but I'm conscious I've. Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
All right, thanks, Louise. So one thing you said, Joe, actually was really inspiring about. I can't remember what you said the pumping station was called, but the treatment works. But this idea that sewerage in the UK in the 19th century was a sort of a gift from God, and you know, it's really interesting. And I don't know, and this could be a question for Christian as well, and I was going to say Amina, but she's not here. But like, how tapped in are we to people? Like, what's the kind of national psyche on wastewater at the moment? Do we have a feel in the UK sort of where we're at?
I can maybe go first, and maybe Christian can jump in. It feels like, well, I haven't seen a sort of 2 weeks like the last sort of the last 2 weeks of how much, you know, the water companies in the UK have been in the news. It's either been about sort of, you know, drought, you know, flood, you know, CSOs, things like that. And it feels like it's going back up the level of priority of what people are interested in. And maybe that's, you know, a result of, you know, the pandemic, people connecting with natural spaces, or people having more interest in the sort of infrastructure that sits around them. But it feels like it's sort of going back up the agenda and becoming more important. But that's, again, that's an anecdote, so it's not necessarily a strict answer. I don't know, Christian, if you have any thoughts.
I think there's a lot to be said. Yes, you look at the past 2 weeks. News articles come. One of the primary examples for me was the news article where it talked about storm discharges have gone up 29-fold in the past 5 years. Well, that simply isn't the case. It's the fact that the monitoring we had 5 years ago were far fewer monitors compared to there are now. Therefore, the monitoring, the reporting, that understanding, you know, the way a lot of CSOs, and this is all being portrayed, is this is a new thing that's only started happening since the water industry has been privatized, or certainly that's sort of the way it seems to be being portrayed in the media. You know, that's not the case. You know, there's, I imagine that between now and the end of my working career, if I stay in the same role, I would just be getting rid of CSOs that have been built over the past, 100 years. When Bazalgette went back to creating that, when he created his sewer network, that would have been a combined sewer network. That would have taken flows from roads as well as sewage from people's houses and all the rest of it. Why? Because it was designed like that to add dilution, because dilution is the solution with the vast majority of these things. And you taking that combined flows will just add that dilution factor, passes it all through, and obviously that was going out not necessarily through treatment, but getting away from people's houses. We're now going, actually, we don't want these, we want separate systems so that we can take the flows that need treating and take those. But at the same time, there is that responsibility around those sort of emerging pollutants in terms of highway drainage, hard standings from industrial areas. The pollutants of those need to go through some form of treatment. We can't just go and separate those and chuck them into the river to get them out of our network. We need to look at how we protect the environment through putting them through swales and examples to take out those pollutants before entering the watercourse. So in terms of that kind of that focus, I think it's very easy to paint the picture of negligence almost using the statistics. But for me, the key piece with all of this engagement with the public is that understanding piece, the understanding of why these networks exist, why they were developed in the way they are, and why it's not a quick fix to remove that. I mean, Steve, you'll know, if we looked at the average of the past 10 years and looked at the number of spills we've reduced from CSOs, and take that number and then divide the total cost of what we spent by that number, that comes out at £240,000 a spill. In Wales last year, we reported on 121,000 discharges. Now, if we say that every CSO is acceptable to spill 20 times a year, that leaves us with 85,000 discharges that we need to get rid of at £240,000 a spill. That's £20.4 billion. That's when it hits home to the customer. That's not an extra £5 on your monthly bill. That's nearer 500 on your monthly bill to get that fixed between now and 2050. That's where this wider piece, and that's where this communication piece needs to go into understand is where there is this driver. You know, Wales has 2/3 of the UK's blue flag beaches. There was a significant investment put into reducing the CSO spills to all of these assets, and we report and feed that information in. Albeit when we do that in certain areas, when during the hot weather we had a pumping station which had an error and reported it was potentially discharging to the environment. It wasn't, but that communication piece to say, hang on, be careful, there could be sewage in the water. You go back 10 years ago, that information wasn't provided to the customer. You know, I grew up going to the Isle of Wight every summer on my holidays, and when I looked the other day when there were the storms, you could see the whole eastern side of the Isle of Wight was red with don't swim because there's been sewage discharged. If that had been this time 30 years ago, I'd have been swimming in that water, not knowing. So the education pieces around that understanding and around that these aren't criminal acts, these aren't acts of negligence, these are legacy issues that we've inherited that we're working towards the resolution on. But that comes at a price, and that price is a very significant price, and that comes from customer money. There's not a magic money pot. But I'm saying this is working for a non-for-profit organisation. Yes, we're a business, we have to make profit in order to fund and grow and develop, but that profit stays within the business and is reinvested, it isn't provided to shareholders in the same way. So it's easy for me to sit from that perspective, knowing that we haven't given billions of pounds to shareholders, which is what other companies are, the way the accusations in the media are being portrayed to those other water companies.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I think, yeah, David, did you want to jump in on there?
I just was going to make a very quick comment because I know we're almost out of time. Is in the countries around the world which don't have sewage management and wastewater treatment plants have got the highest levels of infectious disease. It's unequivocal, and we are lucky in a country like the UK or continental Europe or North America because we've got wastewater treatment plants. Now we've got combined sewer overflows. We've got treatment plants that are not actually that perfect, but they're good and they protect the health and well-being. And one of my fears right now, although I don't disagree with the public concern right now to do with CSOs, is that the whole idea of sewage and wastewater management will get a bad name. Because if you go and I can identify countries, but I won't, places where one of the most proud thing they've got is their wastewater treatment plant and how they manage their waste. So we've got to be careful to not throw out the baby with the bathwater here. Is that CSOs are a problem, and I think it's very encouraging some of the solutions that are being suggested, especially the natural response solutions in them. But I think we've got to be careful. We've got to make sure as a society to recognize the value of what we've got, and because it's going to be one of the ways we will deal with the problem on global scales. So I'm sort of defending wastewater treatment plants, but we've got to make sure people realize the value of what's being done, as well as some of these problems that happen to be being noted right now because we noticed them. So I tend to be a bit of a Pollyanna, but I think we have to solve these problems, but it's solving a system that probably works pretty well in the first place.
Great stuff. Thanks, David. And I think that's a nice sentiment to end on this afternoon. We're just a minute over time. Just to say thank you to everyone who's joined. Hope you found it really interesting. If you have any questions post-call, just you can get in touch with myself and we'll get back to you. And thanks very much to all the speakers today. I personally found it really interesting, and I hope everyone else did too. leave everyone to the rest of your day now. So take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.